first, let me welcome everybody. My name is Naomi Sandweiss. I am co-president with Linda Goff, who is here as well, of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And we're delighted this evening to welcome everybody and to have John Taylor back to present with us again. So let me tell you a little bit about John Taylor. He's a retired manager at Sandia National Laboratories, and he's researched and written or co-written 25 books and serves on the board of the Valencia County Historical Society, the Historical Society of New Mexico, and the New Mexico Heritage Rail Society. So he brings a wealth of information this evening, and I will go ahead and turn it over to John. Again, I am going to mute anybody at this time who is not muted. So if you aren't muted, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Thank you. John, I am turning it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have another opportunity to talk to the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society on behalf of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, and to the people from such a wide area around the country and, in fact, around the continent, I guess. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can start the presentation. Let's see that. This is, so you notice that the topic originally was advertised as Jewish merchants in the Rio Abaja. Well, I expanded it really because I felt there were some other things that would be of interest to this particular audience. So I'm calling it Jewish influences in the Rio Abajo. For those of you who are not familiar with the Rio Abajo, it is the part of New Mexico that is basically south of Albuquerque and north of probably Truth or Consequences or that part. It was originally one of the management districts that the Spanish and the Mexicans had set up for managing New Mexico when it was a territory. So with that in mind, we'll get started. To begin with, there are some sort of bottom lines that I want to go to. First of all, there was really no overt, and I will explain that word in a minute, Jewish presence in New Mexico until the middle of the 19th century. Early merchants in Valencia County were mostly from Germany. Mercantile but not religious influence prevailed until the late 20th century. Interestingly enough, there was very little anti-Semitism. In fact, only one instance that we know of here in this area. There was the continuing issue of what we call conversos, or more commonly known as crypto-Jews. And there are some mysteries, but a few Jewish influences do remain. So we'll talk a little bit about, you see a picture there of the first synagogue in New Mexico, which was up in Las Vegas. Conversos, or crypto-Jews, are argued to have come into New Mexico as early as the first Mexican entradas and lasting into the early part of the 20th century. And we'll talk more about Solomon Luna later on. And some of you may have Can you hear me now? It said I was muted. Was I muted for that whole thing? Okay. All right. So the religious background of the immigrants to the Rio Abajo area can kind of be divided among other groups into three areas. There were the German Jews, and we'll talk about all three families, the Sachs, the Kempeniks, and the Neustadts. There were German Lutherans from a very restrictive Lutheran sect out of Wisconsin. And there were the German Catholics, most obviously represented by the Huning family. But we're going to focus mostly on the course the German Jewish families. And there were three early ones. Moses Martin Sachs, who was in Los Lunas and Berlin. Abraham Kempeneck, who was in Peralta, and I'll explain these geographic locations in a minute, and Simon Neustadt, who was mostly in Los Lunas. Now, if you can visualize the Rio Grande River running north-south, on the west side of the river was and is Los Lunas and Berlin. And remember, in the early days, particularly in the middle of the 19th century, the river was a main barrier. It was not something where you just drove across to go to Walmart, because there weren't many bridges and they weren't reliable and the river flooded and so forth. So the west side of the river and the east side of the river were largely separated. Peralta was here on the east side of the river. In fact, that's where I live. And it was a small unincorporated area. And the Kempeneck family lived here in Peralta. And then the Neustadts were over in Los Lunas, Simon Neustadt mostly in Los Lunas, but he was in there for a long enough period of time that it kind of spanned the east-west separation, because the bridges began to be built. And you see the two other than the picture of the Neustadt store, you see the picture of Hain and the picture of the post office department. And the representation here is one of the early sources of income from the Jewish settlers here was hay. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. In addition, many of the people here, in particular Abraham Kempeneck and Simon Neustadt, were postmasters in their local areas. So they were representative of the leadership of these communities in the area. So let's talk about the Sachs. Well, Moses Martin Benedict Sachs came from a family in Prussia, or some say Bavaria, but it was certainly Jewish. He was born in 1823 and arrived here in Valencia County in the 1840s. He married a lady named Maria Gertrudis de Jesus Baca and converted to Catholicism in 1852. But there was some period when and so I suspect he was not too actively practicing the Jewish faith, but he certainly came from a Jewish family. And most of the children that were born were raised as Catholics. And in fact, there still are Catholic families. So he was, as I say, he was a postmaster, he was a forage agent, and he was a farmer. Forage agents were people who worked for the army mostly, or other aspects of the government, to acquire the needs of the army in New Mexico. And from the 1850s through essentially almost the 1890s, there was a big army presence, mostly as cavalry, in New Mexico. That was the height of what we call the Indian Wars. And so there were a lot of army forts, and of course you got around in New Mexico. New Mexico's a big state, and it was a big open area then. In fact, it even included up until the 1860s what is now Arizona. So it was really a big area. And so the forts had horses and oxen and mules, and they needed a lot of hay. They also needed grain and oats. And so forage agents were responsible for going out and getting that material and then selling it to the army. Sachs was also a postmaster, and he was a farmer himself. So, as I said, horses were fed between 10 and 14 pounds of hay a day. So if each of for example, Richard Stoddard Ewell, who was more famous um, for some say losing the Battle of Gettysburg during the Civil War, was a captain here at the post in Los Lunas. He had 150 men, and each of them had between 1 and 2 horses. So you do the multiplication, that's a lot of hay just for this one area. And there were forts and posts all over the state. And so hay was really a big deal. And so you can see that in 1907, which is after the Indian Wars, so where a lot of this stuff has gone down, the need, two of the three merchants that we talked about, Simon Newstand and Abraham Kempenick, and another merchant named Kemp, sold 60,000 bales of hay to the army, plus grain and wheat and other things. So it was a very important mercantile effort that Sachs was involved in. And you can see by 1870, he had started with a net worth of $500 to $7,000 by 1870, which would be about $260,000 today. So hay and foraging for the army was a big deal. Now, I had mentioned out at the outset that there was very little anti-Semitism that we could find in this area during this period of time, when in fact there was a lot of anti-Semitism in other places in the East and certainly in Europe and some places in Mexico. But the one anti-Semitic slur came from Richard Stoddard Ewell. He was a general in the Confederacy, and as I said, some held him responsible for losing the Battle of Gettysburg because of his actions on the first day. You can see he told somebody that he had been pestered by a Dutch merchant Jew. Well, that's not as bad as some anti-Semitic slurs that people have used then and now. And I point out that Ewell was not what we call a Valenciano. He did not come from down here. And in fact, we have found very little of any discrimination against Jewish people or other um, uh, populations in this part of New Mexico. There have been issues later on in the 20th century in some places like Clovis and Gallup, but in this period of time, there was very little anti-Semitism, if any at all. But the Indian Wars wound down and the forts closed, and so people like Sachs were kind of out of work as hay merchants. But you can see here what I've shown here, and I don't expect you to be able to read all of them. These are just some of his family members that either lived here or still live here. So there are a lot of Saxes in Valencia County. There's a big lot plot in the Catholic cemetery here because, as I said, he converted in 1852. We don't know exactly where he was buried, and unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him. He's probably buried somewhere in the Sachs plot in the Catholic cemetery in Berlin. As I said, his legacy is lots of local descendants, but no real Jewish connection, even with this size of a family, since about 1852 when he converted. So let's talk about Abraham Kempenick. Abraham Kempenick, his family was from North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany, and he emigrated to New Mexico in 1884. He had 3 sons. 2 of them came with him when he and his wife Jenny came to New Mexico. And he was much more active in the Jewish life here in New Mexico. He moved to Peralta, which, as I said, is on the east side of the river, essentially right across from Los Lunas. And it was a stopping point. It was on off and on the old Camino Real. And there was a hotel here, and a bar and a store, and he was a very prominent merchant. Partially, you can tell that because he was mentioned several times in the Albuquerque newspaper. When he and his wife traveled somewhere, it was noted in the social part of the Albuquerque newspaper. And when they had a gathering, they talked about it. Um, he belonged to B'nai B'rith. He also belonged to the Elks Lodge. Um, and I don't think that's a one of these things that's inappropriate, but he did belong to both. He was also a postmaster in Peralta. There was a post office in Peralta. And you can see down at the bottom, that was part of his store. And this is a picture from 1854. It's the only one we have of the store burning. It burned down in the 1850s. Um, as you see, he had three sons. And I'm going to talk to you about Eugene here in a moment because it's a very interesting story. Paul unfortunately died of influenza, uh, and Abraham had died in 1905. Paul died in the 19 teens. And we'll talk about Eugene here in a minute. But essentially, Jenny was left as a widow with one young son, and she moved out of New Mexico quite early on. Abraham is buried in the Jewish cemetery in Albuquerque. Here's a notice about his funeral. A very interesting aspect, and kind of shows you that religion wasn't a real big differentiator. People didn't really worry a lot about it. You see on the left-hand side, that's the Catholic Church in Peralta, Our Lady of Guadalupe, in 1900. And in the upper corner, you see Father Jean-Baptiste Bralier, who was the priest. Now, when this picture was taken, um, Our Lady of Guadalupe was a mission of the Tomé parish, the parish in Tomé, which for those of you who aren't familiar, is about 10 miles south of here. And frankly, it's kind of ugly. Well, Abraham Kempenich, whose store and home was right across the street from the church, designed the steeples. They weren't installed until 1912, and he'd been dead for several years, so he never saw his design complete. But here's a Jewish guy, a prominent active Jewish person, designing the steeples for the Catholic Church. So that I thought was a remarkable statement for the diversity and the lack of any sort of anti-Semitism or concerns in the area. Now, the first mystery comes about with regard to uh, Abraham's son Eugene. Now, Abraham's son Eugene sort of took after his father. He was very active as a merchant and as a politician, and he was the on the State Highway Commission. And in those days, and perhaps still today, highway work is a source of some income and some graft and corruption. Certainly was then, paying for paving material and sand and dirt and which road gets paved and so forth. And so Eugene, and I'm sorry we don't have a picture of him, but he was on the State Highway Commission. Well, he was going to go out to Estancia, which is a small town east of the mountains here, on business. And he was supposed to come back and pick up his mother at the train station, but he didn't. Instead, he came straight home and he drove in a rather challenging way into a corral and went into his house. And apparently he got ready for bed because whatever he was worried about didn't happen. But he went to bed in a pair of silk pajamas with a revolver under his pillow. And sometime during the night, somebody came in and killed him. And the person who was in charge of looking into this was Sheriff Joe Tondry. Well, his name will come up later. He was a very prominent lawman here in Valencia County, and no one was ever found who either owned up to it or was convicted of it. but the rumors around, the people said it was because of that highway business. So people thought that he had gotten on the wrong side of someone who wanted to have a road paved or whatever, and they took it out on Eugene. So poor Jenny was widowed because Abraham had died. This happened in 1921. Paul died in about 1918. So she was widowed with only one young son, and she moved out of New Mexico, and did not come back. She sold the business to a guy named Henry Wortman. So now the Neustadt family. Well, the Neustadt family is interesting. Um, uh, Simon Neustadt, who is really the strongest focus here, his parents were Carolyn Gans and Joseph Neustadt, and they were born in Germany, not sure where. Simon was born in Prussia. Remember that the Kempeniks, I mean the Sachs were either from Prussia or Bavaria. And Simon married a lady named Leah Deutschland, and her family was from Bremen, Germany. And so Simon and Leah had no children. Simon had several siblings, Carl, I'm sorry, Flora, no, Carl, and Samuel. And you notice they're all salesmen. Simon got into the grocery business. Samuel was a liquor salesman in Albuquerque, and Carl, went by Charles, was a merchant in Grants. So the idea of of men coming from Germany to be merchants was not unusual. And in fact, if you expand beyond the Jewish group, the German Lutherans as well were all coming in, and they were merchants. They John Becker opened a bank, and others opened stores. So there was a German focus on mercantilism for the ones who came to New Mexico and to Valencia County. And you see that Simon Neustadt is buried in the Congregation Albert Cemetery in Albuquerque. So Simon had a kind of an interesting, what I call life journey. First, a description of him when he applied for a visa in El Paso. You can see he was short, 5'1". He had a high forehead, you can see that, brown eyes and hair, fair complected, a medium nose. Now, I don't think nowadays that when they describe somebody, they necessarily talk about the nose, but he had whatever you see here is apparently what the people for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, whatever they were, they described this as a medium nose, and he sported a mustache, which he carried all his life. He came from Hamburg. He was born in Westphalia, as I noted here, in 1858. Came from Hamburg on a standard ship. We have the name of the ship. We have his arrival information and so forth in New York. And he got here in October of 1877. And then he came to Los Lunas in 1879, and he started clerking in a store that his brother owned. In 1882, he purchased the store from his brother. And then in 1885, he moved to El Paso for a short period of time. And he was naturalized there, and that's where we got the description of him. He moved back to Los Lunas and bought the store from the Hunings. The Hunings, remember, were the German Catholic family. He bought a store from the Hunings, and he was appointed the postmaster. Built a new store in 1906. And remember our sheriff previously, Joe Tondry? Well, Joe Tondry was very, very close to Simon Neustadt, and Joe Tondry oversaw the construction of the new store. It was chartered in Santa Fe in 1928, and Neustadt died not long after. And in the right hand, on the far right hand side, you can see a picture of Simon Neustadt, and the little boy with him is Joe Tondry, who you saw later as the sheriff. Well, that was Joe Tondry as a very young man who was kind of adopted by the Neustadt family. They, as I said, they did not have children. So this shows you kind of the evolution of the Simon Neustadt story. And I can remember when I first moved here that the Simon Neustadt store was still open. And it kind of went the way of all flesh because of the big box stores. Bag and Save moved in, and it was a little hard for kind of mom and pop grocery stores to compete. But you see in the 1890s in the upper left, you see the wagons and it's a general merchandise store. Once again, you in 1914, you see the old car, but still have horses. 1928, it was called a supermarket. That was, what we used to call things. And then it moved across the street. It was on the corner of what's now Los Lentes Road and Main Street, and it moved across the street as the Family Center. And then by 1984, it was out of business, and you can see it boarded up. And it was bought by Orlando Montoya and Jeanette Delgado. And for those of you who are familiar down here, you know it as Mondel Plaza. Mon from Montoya, Del from Delgado. So Mondel Plaza is where the last Simon Neustadt store was. So he had a long run down here, even though he died in 1928. The name was continued by Tondry and others, and it was a real going concern for many years. So now we'll talk about the second mystery. Okay, we've talked about the three Jewish merchants, Sachs, Kempenich, and Neustadt. Some of you remember my chat about the Los Lunas Mystery Stone, and this is just a quick summary. It's a big boulder, 16 miles west of Los Lunas, and the interesting thing is, there's nothing around it. Well, there is now. The railroad goes by, and old Highway 66 goes by, and there's actually a landfill not too far from it. But it was nothing back in the day, and it's engraved with 216 Paleo-Hebraic characters, which list the 10 Commandments in 65 character groups. It's also referred to as Inscription Rock and the Decalogue Stone, and it was first brought to public attention by UNM Professor Frank Hibben, upper right corner, in 1936. And you can see, if you look at the lower left, you can see the scratching at the top. It had been vandalized by some people with a grinder. The one in the middle shows it's as an image, the way it actually looked originally, although as you see, it sits at a 40-degree angle. So, and the inscription itself is over to the left. So those of you who are so inclined can try your Paleo-Hebraic. That is of the Exodus version of the 10 Commandments. So, where did this come from? Is it a legitimate artifact, or is it a forgery? There are lots of arguments that people have made for it being a legitimate artifact. Some that are pretty strange, like one person thought it was done by a Greek exile from the island of Samos named Zacchaneros, who was running away from some Native Americans and got stuck on Hidden Mountain. There's also the theory that it was a bunch of Paleo Indians running away from an eruption of Mount Taylor. The problem is that there were no Paleo Indians when the last eruption of Mount Taylor occurred about 2 million years ago. And there are some biblical explanations. The lost tribes of Israel, Solomonic traders, or exiled Samaritans. Almost all of these have been rejected by analysis by epigraphers or historians and so forth. So we're kind of left with it being something that was forged. Now, if it's a forgery, it could be early, and you see some of the possibilities early, or modern. And by modern, I'm thinking 20th century. So the earlier ones, you could think there was an expedition to California called the Rodriguez Dominguez expedition in 1776, and they had a translator on there, but it's unclear whether he knew Paleo-Hebraic. There is the possibility of the Mormon Battalion or the LDS Church. The Mormon Battalion was part of Kearny's army during the the Mexican-American War, but the LDS Church has completely denied any connection to it. Or it could have been 19th century German immigrants. Crypto Jews is a possibility. In fact, one of the local priests has suggested that there was a town called Los Quelites, which he says was on top of the little hill. That's been pretty well dispensed with. And he alleges there was an 1802 pogrom against the Jews in New Mexico. We can't find any evidence of that. Crypto Jews are an interesting possibility. The idea is that after I'll get into that in a minute, but let me go to the modern one. The possibilities were that it was a student from UNM, a professional rival, or Hibben himself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Hibben was famous for, or I should say, probably infamous for his archaeological efforts. On the right, you see what we call the altar, which is another carving that's on top of the mountain, or it's not really a mountain; it's just a little hill. It's not hidden. They call it Hidden Mountain, but it's not a mountain and it's not hidden. But this is they call the altar, and it says in again Paleo-Hebraic that Yahweh is great. An interesting story there. A lady from a New York City Jewish publication came out and wanted to see the Mystery Stone. And so we drove out to the Mystery Stone. And as I say, it's 16 miles from Los Lunas, literally in the middle of nowhere. And what does she do? She pulls out her cell phone and calls up a Paleolithic translation program and reads it. Now, that was cognitive dissonance for me, at least. You know, here we are in the middle of nowhere reading a language that's been dead for 2,000 years, but it was an interesting experience. So now the question is, what about crypto Jews, or conversos, as they're also called? The issue started with Ferdinand and Isabella when they initiated the Inquisition in Spain in 1478. Part of that was clearly a reaction to the fact that they kicked the Moors out of Spain and they were trying to assert themselves and assert the Catholic religion as the important religion of the land. Some people from Spain converted, some went to Portugal, and some immigrated to Mexico to get away from the Inquisition. Of course, the Inquisition followed them to New Mexico, and there are scholars who have looked pretty carefully that say that there were conversos in New Mexico, especially in the northern part of the territory, and that some of the early conquistadors and ricos were conversos escaping the hand of the Inquisition after it took hold in Mexico. The Luna family, which founded Los Lunas, the patriarch of the family was Don Jose Antonio Jose Luna, and he married a lady named Isabel Vaca. And DNA from their descendants revealed that there was Sephardic DNA in their ancestry. So there's no question that at some point there were Jewish genes in the family. In addition, that during digging around the Luna home that has occurred, the Luna home, which many of you who are local will know as the famous Luna Mansion, that digging around the Luna home, they found scrolls, Torah scrolls. They found Jewish artifacts, but we don't know where they are now. So it's, that's a rumor. I can't confirm it. In addition, Solomon Luna, who was a very famous local, he was really a businessman. He mostly made his money from sheep, but he was very influential in the writing of the New Mexico Constitution prior to statehood in 1912. Apparently, he signed the register at a synagogue during a visit to New York. Now, some will say, well, Solomon, that's obviously a potentially Jewish name. Well, yes and no. It's not a particularly uncommon male name in New Mexico. Many of us know lots of people whose names are Solomon, and in fact, biblical names are quite common in Hispanic genealogy. So that on its own would probably not mean anything. But some of the other things hint at the fact that there may have been some converso aspects to to Solomon Luna or the Luna family itself. Now, there has been very little Jewish influence in New Mexico since with the possible exception of the conversos and the fact that the Kempeniks and the Neustats attended synagogue and are buried in Albuquerque since the 19th century, the later part of the 19th century. Recently, in 2018, a guy named Andrew Martinez established what he calls a Jewish learning center. There, some places it's listed as a synagogue, but he is careful to call it a learning center called Beit Avi here in Los Lunas. It's a small building over on Route 314, and I have not investigated it thoroughly. I don't know whether there's an issue, whether he's trying to establish converso families, whether he's just trying to give people an opportunity to learn about Jewish history and culture. But it has been over there, and it is open and available to people here in the valley. So, kind of summarizing, um, there's been no overt Jewish presence in New Mexico since there wasn't any until the mid 19th century. And obviously, when I use the word overt, I'm talking about the possibility of conversos. So there could have been converso presence in New Mexico all along that just was not overt, but was literally crypto Jewish influence. The early merchants that we describe in Valencia County, not only the Jewish merchants, but also also the other merchants, largely came from Germany. The Hispanics were suppliers. They provided the grain and the hay and the oats and so forth. And the Germans, the Hunings and the Sachs and the Beckers and the Kempeniks were the ones that put together the mercantile influence in the area. As I said, there's very little anti-Semitism that we've uncovered. I cited you the instance of um, Richard Stoddard Ewell being a little bit nasty in his description of Moses Sachs, the hay merchant. But that's, given some of the virulence, particularly that's happening now, that's really not a super terrible thing to say. But that's the only instance we have. So there was a lot of toleration here for not only diverse religions but diverse and ethnicity. There were of course we said Jews, Germans, other people from Europe, Japanese, before and after the war, and so forth. There is the continuing issue of conversos that is being looked at broadly by scholars today. It's a main area of scholarship in ethnicity in New Mexico. And as I said, there are some mysteries, but very few Jewish influences that remain. The mystery stone, which most people, I believe, and myself included, believe that it has very little to do with Jewish influences, that it was probably a forgery, perhaps by Frank Hibben himself, and it remains a very active tourist site here in Valencia County. The other question, of course, is the I mentioned the mystery stone is Solomon Luna, and the possibility that the Luna family, in addition to other long-lived families or long genetic families here in the valley, actually were conversos, whether they realized it or not. That's the thing about the conversos. The There's a lot of issues that people have uh, performed Jewish rituals. They use menorahs. They have prayer shawls or other things, but it's not clear that anybody really continues to practice the Jewish faith in secret. They have these things. Some of them recognize them as a old part of their family heritage, and some of them just say it's something we've always done. Um, so the idea here is, or not the idea, but my takeaway here is that um, there was a strong influence of Jewish mercantilism in Valencia County throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. Part of it under Neustadt continued until the late 20th century, but it the Jewish aspect of the influence has only really resurrected itself in the house of my father that has been here for about 6 years. So with that, I would happily address any questions or comments or anything else, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you
Turn
very
it over
much,
to you,
John.
Naomi or Linda.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. We have one question so far in the chat box from Lance Bell, who lives here in Santa Fe. And the question is, the descendants of the Sachs family and their knowledge of Jewish roots, how do they embrace it, to the best of your knowledge, if at all?
When I've talked to them, they acknowledge the fact that their, in most cases, great grandfather was Jewish, but he converted. So my guess is he was not a strongly practicing Jew if he converted as quickly as he did once he got here. And so they basically acknowledge it, but they, as near as the people I've talked to know, they don't have any continuing linkage to that part of their history.
Okay. Roberta Sparks, who's with us tonight, has a question. Roberta, would you like to unmute and pose the question, please?
Yeah, let's see if I can. Did I? Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Yes,
Yep.
you're fine.
I think, John, it would be very interesting for you to look at some additional history about the Neustadt. The whole Neustadt family is buried in Fairview Cemetery. They have their own section. And as far as Simon Neustadt, my father bought that store so it went from Simon Neustadt to Mr. Tondry, who sort of carried the store over, and he worked with Rosenbaum and there was another Jewish guy who now I can't remember because I've written the whole article. And Rosenbaum sold the store to my father in 1947. And the pictures that so when my father bought the store, it was exactly like the 1914 picture. And then the pictures where you show the more modern building was a building my father built, and my father and brother ran that store until my father financed Montoya, who by the way went to jail, and he made it Mondale Plaza while my brother and my father built a Bag and Save across the street. So that we the Hayneses, including my brother now, a younger brother who owns a lot of property there, but that whole, so there were 4 generations of Jews that were there, from the Neustadts to Rosenbaum and Dowen, Morris Dowen, and then my father and my brothers. So, and I really wonder about this house of my father. I wonder if this is not Jews for Jesus.
Um, a couple things. Let's see. I believe Leo Haynes must be
My father,
one of the.
my father.
He's your father. And in fact, in the article, the original article, I have all of those, all of that lineage
Yeah.
carried through. And Joe Tondry was, of course, a very important part of that,
Yeah, he lived right
sort of
next door to
carrying.
Simon Newstead. Joe
Yeah, right.
Tondry was the
And
property
as
attorney.
far as yeah, as far as the Jews for Jesus, um, I have not looked into that. It could be, and I don't know whether it is that aspect, or whether it is. He says he calls it a learning center. I have not investigated it, and am hesitant to to try and raise any hackles, but it is the only sort of current link back to the original Jewish heritage down here. But I thank you for pointing out the long history of the Neustadt dynasty, if you will, and how it followed on Rosenblum and Haynes and Leo Haynes and the others, because that is definitely true. Tondry, on the other hand, Tondry was a Catholic. He was
Yes,
not Jewish.
yes, yes.
Right. Good. But thank you for pointing that out.
There's a comment actually for myself, John, in the chat box. I may have mentioned this to you at some point a while back. I did my MA at UNM in Latin American Studies, and I took a couple of courses from Frank Hibben at the time. And it later came about that, as you know, he was known for, quote, discovering the Clovis point a number of years ago, and that was a fraud. So it wouldn't surprise
Yes.
me if, reference to the mystery rock being a fraud could have very well been committed by Frank Hibben. He later on had that, all that came out about him. Unfortunate, but it was true.
Yes. And in my in the book that Richard Melzer and I are putting out, which includes this article on the Jewish merchants, it also includes a much more detailed look at the Mystery Stone. And Frank Hibben not only salted the Sandia Man Cave and then discovered Clovis points, but he also found uh, questionable arrowheads in questionable mammoth bones in Alaska, and his archaeology was, some called it fraud, some called it bad practice. My own sense is he seemed like a pretty smart guy, so I'm guessing maybe on the fraud side rather than the bad practice side. But he married well. He was a big game hunter, and maybe we can remember him for that. I'm told. I unfortunately didn't ever take a class from him, but I'm told he was an extremely charismatic lecturer,
Yes, he
and
was.
that it and he was all his. I'm an engineer, so I prefer to think of things in distributions. And the way people think of Frank Hibben is kind of what I call a binormal distribution. You either loved him or you hated him. There wasn't anything in the middle. And he was he was in fact on the board. In fact, I think he may have been the chairman of the board of Biopark back in the day, and people said he was a wonderful manager. He was on several other boards, and so there were good aspects and bad aspects. But my sense is that the archaeology aspect was maybe one of the bad parts.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from the chat box. Do the folks from Valencia County know if the Ravels had a store in the county, or was it just in the South Valley?
Who? I'm sorry, the name?
The Ravels, or Ravel, R-A-V, as in Victor, E-L?
I am unaware of any store by that name in Valencia County, either in Belen or Los Lunas. There might have been, and might be other people. I don't know if Richard Melzer's on the Zoom or not, he might know, but I have not heard of that store. They're probably, I'm not familiar with all of the mercantilism in the South Valley of Albuquerque, but as far as I know, there wasn't one down here.
Okay.
Roberta Sparks might know.
Roberta has an answer.
The name is Ravel, and their store was the South Valley, like the Brombergs.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Roberta.
Roberta.
Here's another comment. Al Kempenick's daughter married Walter Kahn in Santa Fe. So there is a connection.
Which Kempenick?
Al.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think that was it. I think that was Abraham Jr. Yeah, yeah. I did not follow the full genealogy after they kind of left the local area.
Okay. We have a comment that is from Stan Hortus. Stan's going to talk rather than write it in the chat box. So
Okay.
Stan?
Hi, Stan.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Great. I wanted to add another dissenting voice to the authenticity of the Los Lunas Mystery Rock. Joe Winter, the late Joe Winter, who was the director of the Office of Contract Archaeology at UNM, did a thorough analysis of the stone itself and found that the indentations that were actually done with steel tools that were not in use until the mid 20th century.
Yeah, we've talked about that it would be fairly easy to prove. I have not actually seen that analysis, but we have talked about the possibility of scraping samples and taking them to Sandia Labs, seeing whether they were stainless steel or whatever. It looks to me like the carving was made with modern tools. We haven't searched. And the other thing is, if you stop and think about the ancient aspect, the question you ask about ancient occupation of the area is, where is their garbage? You never find anything other than that inscription. And the Department of Archaeology in Santa Fe has done a detailed look at the top of the hill, and they don't even mention the Mystery Stone. Nobody else even mentions it when they've done their surveys. There's no lore among the local Native American tribes. So I think it's pretty clear that it was a modern forgery.
Yeah. And also, are you familiar with Logie Carrasco?
I don't believe so.
Well, she's one of the early people to come out and talk about the Judaism in her family. And her family is from Belen. And there is a wonderful compendium of articles that it shows up in an anthology by Seth Kunin, Kun.
Okay.
There is a lot of work out there about conversos, and so it's really a subject of a lot of modern scholarship. And Stan, you cut off, so I didn't hear the end of your question.
Okay. Maybe Stan will be able to come back. Are there any other immediate questions or comments? I think I have covered what is in the chat box function. We have another minute or two to prevail upon John for his wonderful
Well, while
talk.
we're waiting, I really want to thank Naomi and Linda for giving me the opportunity to talk to you folks about this subject. It's a very interesting subject, and thanks particularly to Roberta Sparks for enlightening us on the subsequent ownership, which I know about, and it's in the story, but I just hadn't written about it. I mean, hadn't put that into the presentation. It is an interesting presentation, and I think there's a lot more that can be done.
Great, great. And Norma Libman thanks, Stan, for his comments tonight. So let's wind this up. Again, John, thank you for joining us, and everyone here this evening who was able to join us as well. The session was recorded, and it will be available maybe in about a week's time on our dedicated YouTube channel. But a message will go out on our email list letting everyone know that it is available. And let me turn it over to Naomi for just a moment to plug our fall conference. Naomi?
Thanks, Linda. Yes, I wanted to let everybody know our fall conference will be taking place October 25th through 27th at Highlands University in Las Vegas. The conversation really will be about renewal. We'll be hearing from all sorts of different folks, but if you're curious about Congregation Montefiore or even Temple Aaron in Southern Colorado, there will be lots of interesting information. Our brochures will be going out to members in the very near future. In the meantime, you can visit our website at nmjhs.org, and registration's also available there. So we'd love, the more the merrier as far as this conference. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you, Naomi. And also one last plug. If you're not a member, you can also join online. We're a friendly bunch. We do interesting programs and activities. So do consider joining the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And with that, good evening, everyone. And thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.